With the release of Linux Mint 22, like a while ago, I got a fun idea in my head while I was trying to fall asleep. What if I were to run the, well, at the time, brand new Linux Mint 22 on 22-year-old hardware and see what happens? Obviously, a terrible idea. So that's why I'm doing it today. Or at least, that's what my plan was. Hi, it's Future Me here. As I was finalizing this video, it came to my attention that Linux Mint 22.1 has just released a couple days ago, after I had already filmed the entire video using the last version, 22, that came out last summer. It still technically makes sense either way because both have 22 in the name, but now I feel like I have to clarify that this entire video footage and the audio for this video was done when 22 Wilma was still the latest version. So, I don't know. I guess that's just my luck? If it wasn't already clear, I do a lot of stupid stuff on this channel, but I think this might be the dumbest so far. I did an entire video trying to run 5-year-old Ubuntu on an ancient laptop, but this is even older hardware with an even newer operating system. I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong. The hardware in question? None other than my eMachines M6805, which is actually only 21 years old. So, I hate to say it, but you've been bamboozled. I don't know, come back next year and it'll make sense? But it's close enough. The hardware came out in 2003, and this is pretty much about the oldest system you could pretty much expect to run this on, as Linux Mint is 64-bit only and has been for a while. And this eMachines laptop was pretty much one of the first commercially available 64-bit laptops that you could have bought, at least on the consumer side of things, using a single-core mobile Athlon 64 3000 plus processor clocked at a whole 1.8 GHz and utilizing an ATI Mobility Radeon 9600 GPU. This system would have been pretty awesome back when it was new, which is why we're using this computer, and we're going to see what happens. This system has its max amount of RAM at 2 GB of DDR400 megatransfers per second, a 120 gig IDE hard drive, so I already know what the comments on this one are going to look like, a DVD-RW drive, and a wireless G card. It's also unsurprisingly loud. Really loud. And it's running Windows 10. But not just any Windows 10. Windows 10 version 1511 from 2015. But not just any Windows 10 version 1511. Windows 10 version 1511 that was upgraded from the original installation of Windows XP. So, yeah, this install sucks. This will, in theory, give us some comparison, but it goes without saying that this is a whole nother can of worms that I really don't want to get into on this video, other than to say that the experience is so bad that just like the Inspiron 1300 with Windows 10, this has no video drivers at all, and it's even missing audio drivers, because they're just too old for Windows 10. But before we get rid of that crap, this computer has a slight problem that I probably should have known about beforehand, but only discovered while filming this video. This thing has no support for USB booting at all. This BIOS just doesn't see the USB drive. That's pretty annoying. I thought maybe I could update the BIOS to get that functionality, but Acer deleted the drivers for this forever ago. But even looking on archived versions of eMachine's old website from back in the day, there are literally no drivers for this thing officially. And while I did find a BIOS update, number one, it probably wasn't going to work on Windows 10, and number two, it was from December of 2004, and to be honest, I wasn't really convinced that it was even going to allow USB booting either. So then I got the idea that I should have just gotten from the beginning, which was to insert Hiren's boot CD into the computer because it contains Plop Boot Manager, which would, in theory, be able to boot the USB. So that's what I did, and it actually worked. This is definitely cursed. To be honest, I hadn't even validated that this was even going to work on this computer in the first place, so I was kind of surprised to even see this at all. So I let it start loading. And loading. And loading. Yeah, this does not load very quickly. Eventually, we got some errors that, I don't know, looked good. And it started pissing itself about the wireless card, so at least we know already it's not gonna work, and we'll have to actually get to the desktop to figure that out. And after waiting an absurdly long time, it got to the desktop. So, perfect. It actually worked a lot better than I thought. I was expecting this to just honestly not even work on this computer. It even seemed to work with most of the hardware that was in the computer. In fact, the only thing, as far as I'm aware, was the wireless card, which makes sense. It's Broadcom, so I guess it's time to get this nightmare going. I deleted the old partitions straight away because, as much as it would have been funny, I really didn't want to dual boot this with Windows 10. Maybe that's a whole nother video for another time. Anyways, I let it start going, and this is where I noticed my next big thing, which is that it didn't seem to want to write to the hard drive at all. It was just kind of sitting on the formatting thingy for a really long time. It took close to 5 minutes to actually format the drive so that it could start installing. If that's not a bad sign, I don't know what is. This isn't a failing hard drive either. Once the installation started actually going, it took about a half an hour to install, which honestly could have been a lot worse. And it worked perfectly. I actually couldn't believe it. I thought this was going to be a huge challenge to get working, but no, everything just worked straight away. Well, except for the wireless. I still had no Wi-Fi support at all. Again, not really surprising, but annoying. Because I don't actually have any way to download the drivers to the system since I don't have any Ethernet at my workbench. I ended up having to set up another laptop so that I could use its wireless as a router, basically, to get Ethernet on this computer. Once I did that madness, it had internet, which I was actually shocked about because this computer has a VIA chipset, which usually don't work that well on Linux, but I'm guessing things have improved. But even after I had it hooked up to the internet, it still didn't find any drivers for the wireless. So I just tried downloading the Broadcom B43 software through the terminal, which even after doing that, didn't get me any wireless at all. Before I discovered that this computer's wireless card is actually old enough that it's technically supposed to use the B43 legacy drivers, which I then installed afterwards, and it worked. Well, until I actually wanted to connect to the internet on it, because while it did detect my Wi-Fi, it kept rejecting my password. It just kept getting stuck in an authentication loop. I spent a while trying to figure out if I could get this thing to work at all, and to make a long story very short, no. This thing just will not work, at least on Linux Mint, but I wouldn't be shocked if the behavior is the same on other distros. Both my phone's hotspot and my actual internet just didn't work on this computer with the same problems. It just refused to authenticate, so I don't know, something is clearly just amiss there. It's entirely possible that this wireless card is just not actually compatible at all. Supposedly, you can figure this all out using a link that was provided in the installer earlier, so I went to that website to discover that it's dead, so that's kinda useless. And every resource that I found on hardware this old was, at minimum, 10 to 15 years old, and all of the old links are either just not relevant anymore or don't work at all. And it was about at this point that I decided to do the one thing I'm good at, and that was to give up, and pretty much stick solely to Ethernet, since I already spent a lot of time trying to get that working, and it seemed to work just fine. It probably was going to be faster anyway. Not that it's great, but better than nothing at all, I guess. So with that out of the way, I decided to update the system just to get the latest versions of stuff, at least as up to date as I possibly could, and it gave the system something to do. I was going to switch the mirror until I looked at the speed and realized that this was probably going to suck, and it did. This thing took a very long time to do this. Between the slow old hard drive and the slow old Ethernet, this computer probably took close to about an hour to actually get somewhere. But eventually it did it, with no problems at all. So the question now is, can this system do anything? And the answer is, kind of. I figured it's fairly obvious, and I don't need to say it, but the hard drive in this is obviously a problem, and CPU usage was also not particularly encouraging. It seemed to idle around 20% usage, but it didn't take much to get it to go to 100. So I figured I would start with the really scientific test of opening things that came with the computer to see what happened. Obviously, I've cut a lot of the loading time out, but the hard drive obviously is a problem, and it really didn't take that poor CPU much to get working. But it seemed to handle offline applications relatively fine. So let's torture it by going on the internet now, which, well, went about as well as you can expect. This is YouTube playback, so it's not even really fair at all. Pretty much anytime you go on the internet, this thing is just stuck at 100% CPU usage all the time. If it's really a shocker. I'm sure it really doesn't help that the graphics on this realistically probably don't have much of a proper driver either, other than literally to be a display output, and probably contributes at least a little bit to the system feeling sluggish. As for offline media consumption, while playing a music file, it was using close to 10% more of the CPU, and offline video playback really wasn't an option either, as even my 640 by 480 test footage was pretty choppy during playback. So, yeah, I could do more tests, but frankly, I think you already know where this is going. This experience isn't very good. So, before I wrap this up, there was another thought I had while I was planning this. Linux Mint has 3 different versions that you can currently download. Cinnamon, which is what this is, Mate, and XFCE. I probably pronounced those horribly wrong, but I guess I'll find out later. Anyway, because I'm dumb, I decided to try both of those as well, just to see if one desktop environment would perhaps perform better than the other. And because it definitely didn't go wrong at all last time, I decided to triple boot the system, because why not? I have 120 gigabytes of hard drive space, I might as well use it. As I let this installer run, I noticed pretty similar problems to what I had with the first install, which is it took forever to write to the hard drive. And overall, the installer itself took way longer than Cinnamon, closer to 50 minutes. Though there's a bit of an asterisk, because this was still connected to the internet. It's entirely possible this might have been downloading other stuff. So it's not really completely fair comparison there. And afterwards I did XFCE as well, which again took about 35-40 minutes to install. To be somewhat fair, I did fully update both of these installs so that it was pretty much about as even as it could be with Cinnamon. Or at least that's what I thought I was doing, as I left Mate for a while and came back to discover that it had not done anything. I thought it had crashed because the clock on the task manager was not accurate at all, but as soon as I was about to power the computer down, it started downloading again. So, I don't have an explanation for that one. I don't know why that was the case, but it wasted a lot of time because it ended up having to do about another hour after that, meaning it took 2.5 hours just to update this computer. Most of that time was spent downloading stuff over this absurdly slow Ethernet connection. Otherwise, outside of that, well, probably unsurprisingly, there really wasn't any change with these other desktop environments. I did try stuff on them. It worked, it just kind of was the same problems with Cinnamon, which is that the CPU was dying, the hard drive was dying, I was dying. Everything is just so horribly slow on this computer that, well, you can do stuff, but is it worth it? Probably not when you can go buy a computer that's going to be infinitely better for like $20. In fact, there's really no scenario at all where using this setup actually makes any sense, especially with this specific computer where it's big and heavy, it sucks to move around places, it has no battery in it, the cooling fans are horribly loud, it probably has like 5 minutes of total battery life, and really there's not a whole lot I can even do to make this computer better for this, other than, I don't know, not using Linux Mint. There's really 2 big points of issue here, and that's obviously the hard drive and the CPU. Hard drive is a little bit easier because IDE SSDs do technically exist, but they're a lot more uncommon, and while there are almost certainly going to be speed benefits, it's not going to be a lot when the bus speed is limited to 133 megabytes per second. And the second problem, of course, is the CPU, which can't really be solved. I'm sure there are CPU upgrades out there, but number one, this old 3000 Plus already runs fairly hot as is, and there is actually an overheating risk by attempting to upgrade the CPU. Plus, who knows if eMachines even validated it for this computer, given that BIOS support, from what I've gathered, is terrible. And then there's probably the more obvious question, which is, would that really actually make this better? It'd be a faster clock speed technically, but I don't think there's really that much higher up you can go with this. This platform doesn't support any dual-core processors as far as I'm aware. This is socket 754, so yeah. Whenever the CPU usage was fine, it would be doing something that would be using all of the hard drive, and whenever the hard drive was fine, it would be using all of the CPU. It's like there's not really one thing that was solely responsible. But I'm inclined to say that the hard drive is actually the biggest problem in this entire setup, especially because of the concerning amount of time that it took to do pretty much anything. It almost makes me wonder if maybe there's just bad support for the IDE controller or something on this, causing problems, because the amount of time that it took to even do basic things like formatting the drive or, I don't know, opening a program were worrying, since this is a healthy drive and is 5400 RPM, so it's technically better than the one that was in that Ubuntu video, and that one was pretty awful. Perhaps I need to try this again with some kind of flash media solution. Maybe that'll be a video for another day. As for positives, because there are still some positives, first of all, memory was actually fairly good. This thing was fairly efficient on its RAM. Of course, Linux is usually much better than Windows with this, but I was still surprised that this system never came close to running out of RAM, regardless of the desktop environment. The most I saw it use was about 1.3 gigs out of 2, so that's fairly good. And hardware support was actually fairly good. Usually Linux is good with this kind of thing, but I was surprised that this worked as well as it did given the age and obscurity of the components in this system. As for what desktop environment runs best, I'm inclined to say Mate, solely because it seemed to be the kindest to the CPU. The resource usage still wasn't amazing, but it seemed to run better than Sentiment or XFCE. But there really is no major difference. Finally, before I wrap this up, I did this last time, I thought it would be fun to do a boot up test to see really how long it took for these to boot up, because to me, sitting here, it took an eternity to reboot and do anything. And unsurprisingly, neither of them were particularly quick, but Mate was the quickest by a few seconds, with XFCE being way slower than the rest. So, was it worth it? I don't know, I guess it depends on how much ad revenue this video earns. But I definitely enjoyed wasting the last 5 days doing this.